So far, we know 5 of the new ones. 3 are critical mineral mines, 1 in Quebec, 1 in Ontario, and 1 in New Brunswick. Critical mineral extraction is a priority for this government. In the recent budget, it earmarked $2 billion for the sector over 5 years.
Canada is home to some of the largest reserves of critical minerals in the world. We have lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements. They're all widely available here.
Canada just made a move that Washington can't brush off. While Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs and shouts about restoring American manufacturing, Ottawa has quietly taken control of the one resource that could decide the future of the entire electric vehicle race: nickel. And thanks to Prime Minister Mark Carney's new federal budget, Canada is no longer just supplying nickel to the world. It's positioning itself as the clean nickel powerhouse that both Europe and the United States desperately need. For Detroit, this isn't a theoretical policy problem. It's a direct threat to America's EV ambitions, its trade strategy, and even its national security posture.
At the center of the story is Canada Nickel Company, the Toronto-based developer behind the Crawford nickel project near Timmins, Ontario. This is not a routine mining proposal. Analysts at Corporate Knights described Crawford as one of the largest new nickel opportunities anywhere on the planet, a massive, low-carbon operation designed from the beginning to supply battery metals for North America's clean technology industries. Reuters reported as early as 2021 that Canada Nickel had already been in discussions with senior U.S. officials about serving as a secure supplier for the American electric vehicle sector. Back then, the conversation was forward-looking. Today, it has become an urgent strategic reality. Crawford's development timeline now intersects directly with the world scrambling to secure stable mineral supply, with the U.S. under Trump slapping broad metal and battery tariffs on virtually every trading partner, including Canada. This is the environment in which Mark Carney dropped his new federal budget, a document that places critical minerals at the core of Canada's economic and geopolitical strategy. Billions are being committed to mining, refining, and value-added production inside Canada. Ottawa is no longer content with simply digging resources out of the ground and shipping them south. Carney wants domestic refining, domestic upgrading, and domestic control over Canada's most valuable strategic assets. All of this lands at the exact moment when the United States, under Trump's revived America First doctrine, is tightening trade restrictions on metals, batteries, and EV components. The collision between Carney's critical minerals strategy and Trump's tariff strategy is not the coincidence. It is the defining economic clash of the decade.
Nickel is the metal everyone in Washington talks about behind closed doors. Without it, there are no long-range batteries. There are no high-performance electric SUVs, and there is no American claim to leadership in the next industrial revolution. The U.S. hasn't built a reliable domestic nickel supply chain in decades. For years, it quietly leaned on imports from Canada, which historically provided more than a third of America's entire supply of primary nickel. When Trump decided to impose tariffs of 20 to 30% on imported battery metals, he wasn't just going after Indonesia or China. He was hitting the very country that keeps Detroit's battery factories alive. That's where the new problem begins. If the U.S. cuts itself off from Canadian nickel, it doesn't fall back on some abundant American resource. It falls back on Indonesia, where Chinese refiners dominate the industry, and where the environmental footprint is so high that any vehicle built with that nickel will face punishing carbon penalties in Europe once the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism fully kicks in. In other words, Trump's tariffs risk forcing American automakers to choose between paying more at home or paying more abroad. Either way, the EV becomes more expensive and less competitive.
What makes Crawford so disruptive is not just its size, but the quality and strategic value of its nickel. This is clean, low-carbon metal that global automakers desperately need as emission standards tighten. Its production profile puts Canada in a category almost no other supplier can match, and Carney understands how critical that timing is. By placing critical mineral processing and value-added production at the center of his budget, Carney is elevating nickel from a commodity into a national strategic asset. Canada is signaling that it will move up the value chain.
Instead of being the continent's ore pit, it intends to be the continent's refinery, upgrader, and long-term supplier of choice. This shift gives Ottawa real influence, the kind of influence Canada rarely had in previous decades. The consequences for Washington are immediate. If the U.S. pushes too hard with tariffs, Canada has the option to redirect supply toward Europe, South Korea, and Japan. Those markets are aggressively locking in clean nickel contracts and are already preparing their industrial strategies around low-carbon inputs. Every ton that Canada signs away to the EU or Asia is a ton the United States cannot easily replace, especially if it wants to avoid Chinese-dominated supply chains. Trump cannot ignore this because nickel touches every strategic sector the U.S. is trying to protect. The EV industry is just one piece. Nickel is crucial for military jet engines, naval systems, advanced alloys used in aerospace, and even high-density grid storage. A shortage here isn't like a shortage of lumber or furniture. It is a shortage that affects national security, international competitiveness, and America's long-term technological leadership. And the timeline matters. The U.S. is heading into the 2026 USMCA review with Trump demanding concessions from Canada and Mexico. Carney now walks into that negotiation with something Canada hasn't had in decades: leverage. Canada controls the most attractive nickel project in the G7, backed by a federal government that is openly investing in processing capacity and openly engaging with European and Asian partners. If Trump wants to keep American EV manufacturing alive, he needs Canadian nickel. If he wants to export those EVs into the EU without facing carbon penalties, he needs clean Canadian nickel. If he wants to reduce dependence on China, he needs a non-Chinese supply chain, and Canada is the only scalable option. This isn't resource nationalism, it's geopolitical realism, and Trump knows it.
What Mark Carney has done is simple but powerful. He has turned nickel into a national advantage, and he has done it at the exact moment when the U.S. is most vulnerable to supply chain shocks. Canada isn't trying to pick a fight with the United States, but it is no longer willing to play the role of passive supplier while Washington weaponizes tariffs against its own allies. The question now is whether Trump will adapt or escalate. Will the U.S. choose stable cooperation on critical minerals, or will protectionism push America into deeper dependence on China and higher costs at home? And more importantly, if Canada's nickel becomes the key to North America's EV future, who really holds the leverage in the next chapter of U.S.-Canada relations? Canada has already made its move. Now the world waits to see how Washington responds.
Almost all of the current cobalt supply comes from China.
Cobalt is considered a key material in the race to build the batteries that power electric vehicles.
As major financial strides are being taken to open North America's first cobalt refinery plant in North Cobalt.
This is going to be the very first critical minerals project to reach production of any sort of significance in Canada in many, many years.
While headlines focus on tariffs and trade disputes, another shift is quietly reshaping the future of North America. The United States, a country that prides itself on industrial dominance, may soon depend on Canada for one of the most important materials of the clean energy age. That material is cobalt. It is essential for electric vehicle batteries, defense technology, and advanced electronics. And almost all of it today comes from refining operations in China. This is why the announcement from Ontario matters. The province has pledged 17.5 million Canadian dollars toward the first large-scale cobalt refinery in North America. At first glance, it looks like a regional investment. In reality, it signals a strategic turn that could place Canada at the center of North America's energy transition.
The project is led by Electra Battery Materials in Temiskaming Shores, a community in northern Ontario. Once completed, it will produce about 6,500 tons of battery-grade cobalt sulfate each year. That is enough to supply materials for roughly 1 million electric vehicles annually. It will also create around 50 direct jobs in the area, with more indirect work tied to logistics and construction. The cost of building the refinery is estimated at 100 million Canadian dollars. Ontario's contribution is part of a broader financing mix. The United States Department of Defense has already provided $20 million US, showing Washington's concern about reliable supply. Electra itself is restructuring to cut debt by 60% and raise $30 million US in new equity. Talks with Canada's federal government are underway for an additional 20 million Canadian dollars. These are not small gestures. They are building blocks for the first critical minerals project of real scale to reach production in Canada in many years. The economic upside is clear. At current market levels, annual revenues from 6,500 tons of cobalt sulfate could range between 160 and 230 million US. Analysts following Electra's restructuring estimate the refinery could generate around 30 million US in earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation once it is running steadily. Beyond numbers, the strategic benefits are significant. Canada moves from being a supplier of raw ore to holding a high-value position in the EV supply chain. This strengthens its credibility as a secure and transparent supplier without ties to foreign state-linked entities. For policymakers, it reinforces the logic of Bill C-5, known as the One Canadian Economy legislation, which is designed to speed up approvals for mining and energy projects. The refinery shows that Canada can actually deliver. It is a demonstration project, but one with continental reach. Canada also gains something less tangible but equally important: negotiating leverage. In past trade disputes, Ottawa has often been the side under pressure, whether on dairy quotas or lumber tariffs. With Cobalt, the balance shifts. Possessing the only refinery of its kind in North America allows Canada to speak not just as a junior partner, but as a gatekeeper of critical technology inputs. This leverage could shape future talks on auto rules of origin, EV mandates, and even defense procurement, where secure mineral supply is now considered a matter of national security.
The United States faces a basic problem. It has growing demand for cobalt in electric vehicles and defense systems, yet it has no large domestic refining capacity. China continues to dominate the market, and Washington has made clear it wants alternatives. By 2027, when Electra expects to begin production, American automakers and defense contractors are likely to look north to secure supply. Canada cannot cover all of U.S. demand, but this refinery can provide a reliable North American source that reduces exposure to Beijing. That creates a new dynamic. For once, Canada holds a card that Washington needs. Tariffs and trade disputes may strain the relationship, but Cobalt has the power to reset it. The energy transition in the United States will not be built only on Detroit assembly lines. It will also depend on a refinery in northern Ontario, funded in part by a provincial pledge that may change the balance of supply chains across the continent.
We are going to double our non-U.S. exports over the course of the next 10 years. We think we can do it in a much shorter period of time. That's $300 billion of additional exports. Most of that is going to come from Asia, in our view. We're laying out a path for at least $500 billion of additional investment in Canada in the next 5 years.
Canada just made one of the boldest investment moves in its modern history, a $500 billion plan tied directly to its growing partnership with ASEAN. While Washington is still threatening new tariffs, Ottawa is placing its biggest economic bet on Asia. At the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't just give a speech, he unveiled a vision to transform Canada's economy for the next decade and to redefine who its real partners are. This is not a temporary reaction, it is a structural shift. Carney's message was clear: Canada will build, trade, and grow with Asia, whether Washington approves or not. And the $500 billion investment blueprint is the engine driving that transformation. The timing could not have been more symbolic. Just hours after President Trump threatened to impose another 10% tariff on Canadian goods, Carney was across the Pacific greeting ASEAN leaders in Malaysia.
At the Canada-ASEAN Business Reception, he presented Canada as a partner ASEAN can trust. Within days, Ottawa had sealed a free trade agreement with Indonesia, reached an understanding with Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim to complete a full ASEAN-Canada trade deal by 2026, and announced the start of FTA negotiations with the Philippines, whose President Marcos will chair ASEAN next year. In the space of a week, Canada had joined the core of Asia's most dynamic trade network. And for the first time in years, the story was not about how Canada reacts to U.S. tariffs, but how it leads its own trade agenda.
Carney's message came with a concrete number: $500 billion in new domestic investment over the next 5 years. That money will finance the next stage of Canada's industrial rebuild. New trade corridors, port terminals, LNG export facilities, and the first commercial small modular nuclear reactors. At Ontario's Darlington site, construction is already underway. The project will produce 300 megawatts of clean power, with 80% of its supply chain sourced inside Canada, backed by $3 billion in combined federal and provincial funding. Carney described this as part of a national plan to make Canada an energy superpower. The country has the third largest oil reserves and the fourth largest LNG reserves on Earth. Shipments began earlier this year with help from Malaysia's Petronas. By 2030, Canada plans to export 50 million tons of LNG annually, doubling by 2040. The $500 billion plan also includes major upgrades to Canada's railway and port logistics, allowing goods to move from Saskatchewan's grain fields to Asian harbors in less than 2 weeks. Analysts at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce estimate these new routes could add 1% to GDP growth by 2028 if fully built. Instead of responding to U.S. tariffs with anger, Carney is using them as fuel for Canada's biggest wave of industrial investment in a generation. Behind this plan is a clear strategy: double Canada's non-U.S. exports within 10 years, adding roughly $300 billion in trade, according to the Canada-Asian Business Council. To achieve it, Ottawa is working on 3 fronts. First, new bilateral and regional pacts across ASEAN. Second, using Canada's dual membership in the EU and the CPTPP to connect the 2 blocs, effectively creating a bridge between Europe and Asia. Third, attracting capital from Asia back into Canada to finance infrastructure, energy, and technology projects. Carney's line that Canada can do more than one thing at once defines this approach. The goal is not to pick sides between Washington and Asia, but to build economic leverage with both. Trump's tariff pressure was meant to pull production into the U.S. Instead, it pushed Canada outward. The latest trade data from the Canada-ASEAN Business Council shows double-digit annual growth in two-way investment for the past decade, hitting a record $24 billion in 2024. Much of this surge came after Washington began raising import duties. Every new barrier from the White House has accelerated Canada's diversification. ASEAN investors, particularly from Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia, are now pouring money into Canadian energy, mining, and agri-food projects. What was meant to isolate Ottawa has instead made it a magnet for Asian capital. Economists at the University of Toronto note that foreign direct investment inflows from ASEAN alone jumped by 38% between 2023 and 2025, marking one of the fastest shifts in Canada's modern trade history. Businesses that once looked south are now looking west, seeking long-term certainty beyond Washington's politics. Trump's plan is backfiring. The tariffs built neither American jobs nor trust, they built Canada's independence.
This pivot is not ideological, it is practical economics. Canada owns the resources and credibility that Asia needs: secure energy, stable food supply, critical minerals, and one of the world's safest financial systems. Canadian pension funds, managing over 1.8 trillion Canadian dollars, according to Statistics Canada, are already major global infrastructure investors. By linking them with ASEAN's sovereign wealth funds, Carney is creating a two-way corridor of capital where Asian investors fund Canadian projects and Canadian funds help develop clean energy networks across Asia. His cabinet reflects that vision. Key officials come from industry and finance rather than politics, former CEOs, investment bankers, and infrastructure specialists. They treat government as a growth platform, not just an administration. In short, Carney is governing like an economist, focusing on execution, scale, and credibility, the very qualities global investors look for.
At the ASEAN summit, two different economic models faced each other. The Trump team came with threats of new duties. The Carney team came with contracts and investment plans. Canada also offered something that resonated deeply in Asia: reliability. With an 85% clean electricity grid, one of the highest in the G7, and a plan to expand it by half through nuclear and renewables, Canada stands out as both a resource power and a climate-conscious partner. For nations seeking stable, rules-based trade, that balance of energy and ethics matters. It allows Canada to play a role that neither Washington nor Beijing can easily fill: a bridge economy that combines openness with trust.
What began as a reaction to tariffs has become a long-term realignment. Canada's $500 billion plan is more than an investment program. It is a declaration of economic sovereignty. If fully realized, it could reshape North American and Asia-Pacific trade for decades. By binding ASEAN, the EU, and the CPTPP into one connected system, Ottawa is laying the foundation for a new kind of middle power leadership, one based on capital, credibility, and clean energy. Trump's economic nationalism was meant to restore U.S. leverage. Instead, it is isolating Washington and empowering its closest ally. Canada is not retaliating with noise. It is responding with vision. Trump built walls. Carney is building corridors. And as those corridors begin to carry Canadian energy, technology, and capital across the Pacific, the balance of power in North America and beyond may never look the same again.